Thank you for joining us for another edition of Engaged, Religion and the Common Good, a conversation series exploring questions relating to global affairs and the human condition. The series covers a variety of topics from poverty and peace to climate change and good governance, as well as tradition and technology. Our conversations engage local and global partners, including students, educators, and journalists. For suggestions on topics and themes, please email us at ansari@nd.edu. I'm Charles Powell, Adjunct Assistant Professor of Multi-Faith Engagement, and I'm joined today by Georges Enderle. George is John T. Ryan Jr., Professor Emeritus of International Business Ethics at the Mendoza College of Business and Concurrent Professor in the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. He is a fellow of the Keough Institute for International Studies, the Nanovic Institute for European Studies, and the Liu Institute for Asia and Asian Studies. He is former president of the International Society of Business, Economics, and Ethics. George has authored many books and articles, and I am pleased to have him join me today. In this edition of Engaged, Religion and the Common Good, we will be exploring environmental, social, and governance, also known as ESG investing. According to the CFA Institute, investors are increasingly applying these non-financial factors as part of their analysis process to identify material risk and growth opportunities. According to the Motley Fool, ESG investing is a form of socially responsible investing that prioritizes financial returns alongside a company's impact on the environment, its stakeholders, as well as the planet. The financial performance of ESG stocks has recently drawn investor attention. During the market turbulence related to the COVID-19 pandemic, many companies with strong ESG track records showed lower volatility than their non-ESG counterparts. To many investors, that performance validated ESG investing and its premise. That good corporate behavior means better business results. Professor Enderle, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Charles. I'm very pleased and honored to be part of your series. I think the Ansari Institute does a great job to engage religions in world affairs. And I have been working in the field of business ethics, international business ethics for many years. And so I'm very happy to talk with you on those important questions.
Thank you, George. And without further ado, we'll dive right into the questions. And you have many great answers for us, and you can certainly provide us with a lot of good direction on ESG and how important the investing process is. ESG investing has been receiving a lot of coverage recently. According to a global survey conducted by consultancy.eu, media coverage of ESG investment increased by 75% in 2020 over 2019. Can you explain what ESG is and why it is gaining so much coverage, especially from many who identify as religious?
Yes. Well, ESG investing has those three letters. E means environmental, S social, and G governance criteria, in addition to traditional financial criteria for investing. And as an example, I take those examples from the Fidelity Investment website. E means, for instance, look at the carbon emissions of the companies, renewable energy, water management, pollution and waste. That is E, environmental performance. S means what about human capital, about human people, about product safety, about data privacy, diversity and inclusion of minorities, etc. And the G is concerns governance, which means executive compensation. How do the companies deal with that? What is the board composition of men and women and minorities? And capital allocation, how much do they allocate, say, to investing, to training, etc. The term ESG was prominently used by the Principles for Responsible Investment, which was founded in 2006 and is in partnership with the UN Environmental Programme Financial Initiative and the UN Global Compact. You know, the Global Compact was started by the Secretary General of the United Nations in 2000 to involve companies in addressing major challenges we face on our planet Earth. And PRI says it's is the world's leading proponent of responsible investment. In 2021, there were about 4,500 signatories with a total investment of about 150 trillion US dollars. That's quite an amount. And in the United States, we have about 836 signatories, which means investment managers, asset owners, service providers, from banks, from churches, NGOs. So it's quite a large number now. Why ESG investing? Well, the short answer is to influence companies to behave in a more responsible way, to exert that influence through investment. Of course, we know also consumers can have an impact if they organize a boycott against a company which is doing bad things. But investing in a way, I think, is more powerful because it is about decisions about the future, what the company is actually doing now and in the future. To give you an example, a few days ago I watched BBC, and BBC reported about miserable working conditions in the Democratic Republic of Congo, namely in the mines where the precious metal cobalt is being extracted by Glencore, which is a global corporation actually headquartered in Switzerland, for the American corporation Tesla to produce electric cars. And then the Sisters of the Good Shepherd in the DRC region of the mine saw the miserable working conditions of the miners and wanted to help them. They bought some shares of Tesla and submitted the proxy statement to Tesla, which though was declined by the CEO Elon Musk, who has a worth of $297 billion. So that is just one example, but in my teaching I could invite it often a sister from the Holy Cross to learn about how do they invest with a religious motivation, or also to ask the Notre Dame Chief Operational Officer in investment what are the criteria of Notre Dame. The Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility was founded already in 1971 in New York, and it has about 300 members organizations from faith communities, asset managers, unions, pension, NGOs, and other investors. And most recently, the US Conference of Catholic Bishops approved the new socially responsible investment guidelines 2 weeks ago. So these are examples how religious faith organizations and others are more interested and want to participate or to use their investment for pension funds for a good purpose, to make companies more responsible. Why has US investing gained so much coverage? Well, I think on the one hand, there is a bigger realization that investment decisions are extremely important. And second, on the other hand, currently, well, what is going on is highly insufficient, and widespread short-termism is dangerous. I remember the global financial crisis in 2007-2009, and you know, that has deeply shaken the trust in banking and finance. It was the president of the American Finance Association who talked about the financial crisis and has a long list of penalties of banks in the United States and worldwide, how they violated legal and ethical standards over many years. So the need for ethics is very important. And but I think even if ESG has made a lot of progress, there is still a long way to go. and it is difficult to assess how the long-term impact of any investment might be, because the long term is full of uncertainties, with positive and negative consequences. And also, if you focus only on short term of the results every 3 quarters, every 3 months in a quarter, you lose sight of the long term. So these are a couple of reasons why I think ESG has become an important movement, and also at the Glasgow conference on global climate change, it was a lot of talk, what can investment help to address climate change? And the former governor of England, Mark Carney, said we need about 100 trillion US dollars just to address the costs of climate change. These are enormous amounts, and if private business is not joining that movement, we can never solve the problem.
Mm-hmm. Well said. Thank you, George. Professor Enderle, in September of 2020, Nicole Connolly, head of ESG investing, Fidelity Investments, and Sarah Pulsifer, vice president of investment product, recently published an article titled "Become a More Conscientious Investor with ESG." In the article, they highlighted the fact that the S in ESG is moving front and center, especially during the pandemic. Why do you think this is happening? And can you forecast if this will continue to be the trend in 2022?
Well, S means, of course, social impact and performance of the company. And so it has become very important, although I think right from the beginning of PRI, of the Principles for Responsible Investment, S was a very important issue, but it did not get that attention we have today. Well, why? Well, S means particularly how are people treated in investment in terms of human rights. For instance, the example I gave from the Democratic Republic of Congo, how workers in that mine are miserably treated. So the violations of labor rights and human rights, private privacy rights, which are violated. Then minorities, mining has a huge issues, not only on the environment, but also on indigenous peoples, that indigenous peoples are evicted from the areas, or they are not compensated, they are not part of the process to discuss humane investment policies in those areas. So, and then of course, as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights made very clear already in 1948, no discrimination of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, social origin, property, birth, or other status. So human rights have become very important, which concern, of course, human beings, social performance, and they are also very integrated in the sustainable development goals, like, for instance, number 2, no hunger, or to be good health, or quality education, or gender equality, or sustainable cities and communities. I think these are a number of reasons why S has become much more important than it has been before.
And why do you think the indigenous peoples have primarily been absent from the table? Any thoughts there?
Well, I'm actually part of a research project to look at human rights and mining. Yesterday, I was invited to a panel, to a presentation of students who talked about the Yanacocha mine, gold mine in Peru, which had a spill of mercury and affected hundreds of people. And that's not only in Peru, but in Nigeria and in many other countries, mining companies are extremely aggressive. They want to find gold, and particularly in this case, in Peru, it was cobalt for semiconductors, and so they are aggressive, and because we don't have a strong international human rights law which could prevent those violations.
So, George, this year you wrote a book on corporate responsibility for wealth creation and human rights, and I'll say a bit more about that book towards the end of our show today. But it was published by Cambridge University Press, and I'm wondering, can you unpack this for us just a bit? Often wealth creation and human rights do not complement each other, but this is changing. How is this changing?
Well, you know, when I started studying business ethics, I was very interested in poverty. What can we do to overcome poverty? And I did not think of wealth. I thought wealth is just a lot of money. And that was, of course, with hindsight, a mistake. I then taught and did research in China for many years, since the 1990s, and could observe how the Chinese economy was developing and developing to the benefit of millions of people, which does not mean that everything was good, but I thought we have to think hard about what makes a country actually rich. And the short answer is, it's not just money. Money can even make a country poor if we just follow money, but it's economic, natural capital, economic capitals, human capital and social capital, and the richness of a country is a combination of private and public goods. And that was an insight I developed over years, and I thought that yes, in economics we do not only talk about private goods, which are most the goods we have, and the market is a good instrument to produce and allocate private goods, but public goods like sunshine or trust in the financial sector. Public goods are cannot produce by markets and not by self-interest. So we need other regarding interest, and the world religions, I think, should play an important role here, you know, to help produce public goods. And so that's why I thought, you know, I did a PhD in economics, and so that's why I was interested in richness or wealth. And Adam Smith talked about the wealth of nations, but I think today we need a radically improved understanding of wealth, which has those components of 4 types of capital, and public and private. And then why human rights? Well, you know, human rights, I did actually my second PhD on poverty in Switzerland. And so I was thinking, well, what kind of ethical considerations are important even in a rich country, you know? And I discovered a philosopher in Chicago, Alan Giworth, who did a lot on human rights. And I thought, yes, I mean, what is happening if poverty exists in Switzerland? This is a violation of the human right to adequate food and an adequate living standard. And then furthermore, I thought, well, human rights are actually public goods. And the economy needs those public goods in order to produce private goods. The example of the Democratic Republic of Congo I mentioned at the beginning can illustrate that. You know, if the workers and the miners have enough food, are paid decently, have an education and a job, they can help build up Congo to a flourishing country. But if foreign global corporations are exploiting those workers, Congo has no chance to develop to a healthy country.
You know, Manfred Stutkin, in his book, Ethical Investing, Opportunities and Challenges of Morally Justified Investments, raises a very important question. What moral rules and considerations should actually guide an investor? And you've been touching on this just a bit. Surely one size doesn't fit everybody. So what important considerations should an investor make when exploring investments?
Yes, that's an important but quite a complex question, you know. But if we ask for ethical guidelines for ethical investment, I think in a way we are not, we do have guidelines, and in that book you mentioned, and also in other books and publications, they mention those 10 ethical common sense principles. And so that is, for instance, the principle of non-injury. We should not harm other people. We should not harm the environment. We should not harm animals. So that is a very basic principle, which is not only in the Western and in the Abrahamic tradition important, but also very important in Buddhism. Do not do harm. So that is, and to be clear about how investment does often harm people, and in ways which we are not aware of maybe, but it happens, and so the responsibility is there. Another principle is veracity, to be truthful, and that means, you know, in terms of investment, transparency is a very, very important principle. It is supported by many international organizations and also by PRI, etc., which means transparency means that investors, say in the mining industry, have to disclose, do they talk about indigenous people or not? Are they involved from the beginning of the planning to the end? Are they paid? How are they paid? What does the company have a clear strategy for ESG or not? So all those questions, transparency, and in banking, I think, is very important. And if we remember the global financial crisis, you know, transparency was missing miserably. We did not know what was going on with those banks in the derivatives, etc. And all of a sudden, our financial system almost collapsed. And so transparency and veracity is another principle which is important. Then, of course, for instance, also principle gratitude, which I was a little bit surprised that I found that, but I realized, yes, well, what about our donors at Notre Dame? You know, they made a lot of money, and gratitude to say, well, we want to pay back something to Notre Dame because we got such a good education is an important thing. And other principles. But you see, these common sense principles, which go back to a famous philosopher, David Ross, in the United States in 1920 or 30, are actually common ground which we can find in all world religions. And there are two important declarations which came out already in the 1990s, the Interfaith Declaration of International Business Ethics, which is concerns particularly has been developed by the king from Jordan and Prince Charles and Evelyn Rothschild as a representative of Judaism. So Judaism, Christianity, and Islam were working with people who knew about business and investment and what are the guiding principles, and we found a lot of common ground.
And I think that leads us really into the next question that I have for you. You just returned from visiting with family in Europe. You had a good time. Safe travels in spite of the pandemic. Before you left, we had met and had coffee, and something we began to talk about had to do with the United Nations and her guiding principles on business and human rights that was published in 2011. Protect, respect, and remedy were common themes. Again, you've already touched on some of this, but in a broader way, can you unpack some of this for us?
Yes. Well, that was a very important development for business and human rights. I mentioned PRI, which was started in 2006 in the wake of the Global Compact promulgation in 2000. And in 2006-07, Kofi Annan asked a professor at Harvard University, John Ruggie, to develop guidelines for business and human rights, and to make it as clear and understandable as possible. And so over 5 years, he developed in many conversations with people from business, from NGOs, from government, from churches around the world, and came up with those guidelines. And those guidelines have three criteria when they say companies, independent of states and governments, are responsible for not violating human rights. And there are three criteria. First, causing. Does the company with its conduct cause violations of human rights? And I have two examples. For instance, if a company, the exposure of factory workers to hazardous working conditions without adequate safety conditions. So they have the workers have to go down to the mines and have not the safety equipment which is necessary. That's a violation of human rights which is direct, and regardless what the state requires, that can be Nigeria or wherever, companies are responsible. Interestingly, John Ruggie, he was a professor of law, and he was very sharp and understood legal questions, but he never talked about ethics, but he implied ethics all the time. And so I think people like me and many friends of mine who are working in business and human rights have to provide the rationale behind those guiding principles. A second criterion is if a company contributes to violations of human rights. And an example is, for instance, that if the company is targeting high sugar foods and drinks to children with an impact on child obesity, they know exactly that child obesity will be caused. Of course, they do not tell the children to do it, but they are trying to influence the children or the parents, and that would be also mentioned as a violation of a right to health. Or to change product requirements for suppliers at the 11th hour without adjusting production deadlines and prices, thus pushing suppliers to breach labor standards in order to deliver. That's a very famous example. Apple, which was producing with Foxconn, a Taiwanese company in Shenzhen in China, mainland China, next to Hong Kong, they did actually that. They changed the product requirements for suppliers at the 11th hour. They needed a different glass on the screen, and so that was the working conditions were so horrible that about 12 people, young workers, committed suicide, jumped out of the dorms. And third criterion is no contribution directly to the violation, but the company is linked. Say, for instance, the company provides financial loans to an enterprise for business activities that in breach of agreed standards result in the eviction of communities and indigenous people. So also bank can violate human rights also through those linkages, because they have an important influence on those companies which actually are operating on the ground. A final point which I should mention is that John Ruggie and the guiding principles require companies to do a human rights due diligence process, examination. And that means, like companies, when they produce, in the pharmaceutical industry, produce medication and tablets, and they need to know what's the quality of those ingredients of the medications. And there are many cases which show that companies became very aware and very strict about the quality of the product. But here it's about the quality of the working conditions. And so companies can and should examine when they go to another country or when they are working with another supplier, what are the working conditions. And this is something which here at Notre Dame, in a committee, I was part of that. We were developing a Notre Dame policy for human working conditions in the supply chains for Notre Dame products, licensed products like Notre Dame caps and T-shirts. So, in other words, investors do have power. They have to be smart. It's a complex issue, and one has to look at it. But those guidelines are really something which are helpful, and these are standards which are worldwide now widely accepted. I mean, that's another important thing. It's not good that each company is developing its own standards of ESG. We need common standards, universal standards, so that we can compare companies and their behavior.
A few moments ago, you shared some very horrific stories as to why we need to have regulations to protect human rights. I have a question for you, and being an esteemed professor like you are, I'm going to ask that you treat this question as a student is in your classroom, and the student comes up to you and says, Professor Enderle, why does finance need ethics, and what does it mean to be ethical? What would you say to that student?
Yes, well, a very short answer is that finance needs trust relationships. Without trust, finance cannot exist. And we realized that, I think, or many people realized that at the end of the global financial crisis, trust was broken. And if trust is broken in finance, you cannot do. You don't want to give money to other people, and you know that you will lose that money. And so it was trust, and that is, I think, based on stability of relations and reliability of people and integrity of people. So, in a way, I think when we discussed this book on ethics and finance in ethics and responsibility in finance in my classes many times, and students, I asked always, give me examples how when trust in banks or in investment policies was violated or was honored, and how do you feel? I mean, that is a way to start about this. But it's only a start. And I think, we need investment is a very complex issue. And so we need to study that and to listen to people who are experts, but not only experts in finance, but they have to be experts also in about social issues, about environmental issues, about how to run a company honestly and with integrity. And that's why I think business ethics is extremely important, particularly in business schools, like here at the University of Notre Dame, because we are educating young people, and they are going to have high responsibilities in business. And if they think that business is just a value neutral affair and investment is just about making money, they fail, I think, personally, and for their companies and for society as well.
There was a recent article in the Financial Times that called a lot of attention. It was written by Sarah Cohen-Williamson, and she argued that the European stance on ESG investing is superior. The regulatory pressure in Europe is tough on environmental, social, and governance issues. In the US, the regulatory momentum seems to be going the other way. Do you think that one is superior to the other? If so, why?
Well, you know, as you said, I'm from Switzerland, and I've been in the United States now for 30 years. So I'm crossing the Atlantic have crossed it many times. And I think to compare Europe with the United States is almost unavoidable, but one has to be careful. And, you know, that article you mentioned was written, I think, in 2020, and did not take into account that the Biden administration has now made it easier to invest in ESG funds. After Donald Trump, you know, in his administration, was really doing everything to kill those ESG perspectives. So, and I think that at that conference on climate change in Glasgow, John Kerry did a very good job, how he was trying to negotiate between Russia and China and India, so that also the big powers, economic and political powers, are doing more. But I also think I mentioned before the former governor of England, of the Bank of England, who said that we need 100 trillion US dollars just to address the climate change. And climate change is only one factor of ESG. So, you know, we are far behind what we should do. And I think it's a long way to go. But I was pleased to see that in Europe, in the European Union, they are now preparing legal laws which require big companies to live up to the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. The 3 criteria and the human rights due diligence is becoming law. And that's true also in Germany. In Switzerland we discussed that, but it did not was not accepted by the people, although by the cantons, the minority of the cantons. But anyway, I think that is something which is in preparation, and it would be it is necessary that also the United States are doing much more than they are doing right now.
So, Professor Enderle, some in our audience are wondering, how can they become a more conscientious investor with ESG? What steps can they take to get started?
Yes, well, there are a number of steps, but first I think to get sensitized by bad examples. You know, that's why I gave that bad example from the Sisters of the Good Shepherd in the Congo, how they realized working conditions of the miners in the Glencore mine, these are not acceptable. For that, they didn't need philosophical arguments, but they are could understand that as we could understand the necessity of human rights after the Holocaust. And the second step is, well, learning from good examples. You know, there are also good examples like Unilever, who is doing a lot of things about sustainability. And then to get clear and reliable information about what's going on in the companies. That's very important. Watching critically, you know, so many companies come out now with ESG reports. Apple published the ESG report 2021. So we can read in classes or privately or in groups or in churches, we can read what do they say and do they live up to those standards. And if not, we can buy, as I mentioned, some shares, or maybe we have, or our university has some shares and can become active in requiring that. This is called shareholder activism. And I think many people today, banking and investors, say that actually shareholders are today much more interested in ESG requirements than they were, and it is often the management of companies which is lazy and does not want to change anything. And then finally also to support policymakers who have an ESG agenda. And I told that my friends in Switzerland, you know, when the Swiss people can vote on making the guiding principles legally binding, well, then you have to go and ask what are the politicians doing and what are you yourself doing and voting in favor of that and not against it. So there are a number of things, but we need more knowledge and sensibility for those issues, because international human rights are important, but they are not so powerful, and we have to work on implementing human rights in the global in global business.
Professor Georges Enderle, thank you for spending some time with us today on this very important topic, ESG. Audience, if you haven't already done so, I highly recommend George's new book that was published by Cambridge University Press and came out this year, Corporate Responsibility for Wealth Creation and Human Rights. And I'm wondering, Professor Enderle, before we leave, can you talk to us for just a moment or two about some of the work you're doing here locally in the prison?
Well, you know, as you know, I'm retired. I retired on the 1st of January 2020. And so I enjoy that freedom, but I want to do some meaningful work even as in retirement. And so a friend of mine, Steve Fallon, asked me if I would be interested in teaching a course on business ethics to prisoners in Westville Correctional Facility near Michigan City. And I know that he and many colleagues from Notre Dame and St. Mary's and Holy Cross College are actually teaching courses, and prisoners can do a license, a certificate in those studies, so they have a qualification when they get out of the prison to say, we were not lazy in the prison, we wanted to improve our knowledge, our capabilities, how to write and read, how to understand business, how to understand politics and society. And so I thought this is really an important thing, and I'm going to start teaching in January next year. And of course, I will talk about ethical investing, and human rights, and use my book on wealth creation and human rights with my students. And I'm also very curious and to know what they think. And I was told they are extremely engaged and active and want to learn. And so I really look forward to having a new teaching experience, and hopefully to make some helpful to provide some support to those people in very difficult situations.
Professor Georges Enderle, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much, Charles, and I wish you a wonderful, Christmas, of course, and holiday. But I'm very happy that that we can build bridges, between religion and business and economics. That's very important, and I think we have that possibility here at Notre Dame, and we should use it as much as possible.
Absolutely. Thank you. Audience, thank you for joining us for another edition of Engaged, Religion and the Common Good, a conversation series exploring questions relating to global affairs and the human condition. The series covers a variety of topics from poverty and peace to climate change and good governance, as well as tradition and technology. Our conversations engage local and global partners, including students, educators, and journalists. For suggestions on topics and themes, please email us at ansari@nd.edu. Until next time, I'm Charles Powell. Goodbye.